So question 22 continues on, and part B, what you are doing is assessing the method. So not necessarily completely related to the data side of it here, but just keep in mind that assessing methodologies is quite an important part of the course. But in part C, what you need to do is use the information from the graph. You need to use that to work out the pressure. And in that case there, what you are looking at is this idea of taking the information. And so you need to be able to, one, get the information from your graph, and then realize that if it's 1 over 1.1 litre, then you calculate that and you should be getting about 0.9 of a litre, and then using that to work out from the graph the pressure. One of the things they would do is if your graph's bad, as long as you use that methodology, you should be fine when it comes to part C. You're not going to lose marks if your graph is, well, you lose marks for the graph being bad, but you won't necessarily use it there. And one of the key things here, this is just some information from NESA, basically saying that the drawing of graphing is quite important, and particularly if you're going to get a line of best fit, use a ruler if it's appropriate. Some people as well realizing that in that case there, because it's sort of continuous numbers, you need to have a line graph. Now, question 24, another data question from 2020, and you're given a graph. You need to understand what the graph is telling you. And so in this case here, we're looking and comparing the spending on space research and comparing that to spending on welfare. And of course, that's one of the things that a lot of people argue about, that things like research, we should be spending that on helping people or moving people out of poverty. And part A, what you need to look at is a conclusion. And it's one of the things I think it's easy for people to make a mistake here is not realizing and not processing the fact it's only asking for 1970. And so all you have to really do is go back there and see 1970, more money was spent, according to this here, than on welfare. Now, of course, that's not the whole story, because one of the things you've also got to identify is that the spending on welfare is a completely different set of axes than what's on the left-hand side. The left-hand side is dollars times 10 to the 9, and on the left it's welfare spending on 10 to the 11. And so that is something that is really important to identify as well, because when you look there, even though it's quite easy from that part of the graph, there's more spending on welfare than space research. And a lot of students didn't identify that there was different scales. And so it's really important that people sort of make sure you have a look at even small details like the value of those different graphing scales on the left and the right hand side. And again, more constructing and interpreting. Now this one here, question 29, this is a question that was quite difficult for a lot of students. And at the heart of it, it's a question about the Doppler effect. And you've got to identify a couple of things there. And you've got to add on to your graph the sound from the trumpeters on the ground in a straight line and sound from trumpeters on the train. And what you've got to realize is a few things about the Doppler effect. And again, even though it's talking about the Doppler effect, it's a graphing question. It's about interpreting that there. And so students had to recognize that the pitch from someone next to the trumpets doesn't change, but on the train, it does. And so you can have different variations on the graph as long as you have that basic outline of the pitch on the ground remaining the same and the pitch on the train appearing to be different. And of course, you do need in question part C of that question to talk about the phenomenon. And so in this case here, you've got to link what you've shown in your graph to the theoretical idea, which is the Doppler effect. And that's probably one of the hardest things there, is make sure that when you are looking at the expected results, that you clearly link back to that question there. And of course, the expected answer here, you have to relate all the experimental results to the phenomenon. And so what you need to do is explain why you drew those two graph lines, or what those two sets of data. Now, one of the things as well, and it was asked in a couple of things here, and this is another basic strategy to consider, is that validity, reliability, and accuracy. That's probably the biggest underlying theme to the course. Know what the terms are. Also, when you're doing revision, apply them to every investigation you've done, whether it's a first-hand investigation, whether it's a second-hand investigation. Maybe you did some of the investigations as simulations. Assess each of those things in all of them. And because it's most likely there will be at least one or two, if not even more, questions which ask you to assess those things. And just remember as well not to confuse them with each other, because it's quite easy to do that. And you see in some of that feedback from the marking centres, students, it's quite common for them to mistake those for each other, particularly validity and reliability. And remember that validity is your experiment testing what you set out to do. Reliability is whether you're actually getting similar results. And accuracy can refer to a couple of things, how precise your instruments at reading are, but probably the main one we're talking about here is whether we're actually finding results that are close to what an accepted value would be. Again, just some more reiterating that their reliability for the most part usually refers to repetition, and that idea that you're repeating results over and over again. And validity, does it actually test the hypothesis? And validity doesn't really change much between first and second-hand investigations. Usually in first-hand investigations, it's just, have you controlled all the variables? Are you accurately testing the dependent variable and the independent variables? In second-hand investigation, when you're looking at the reliability, you're probably also looking at whether the data that you've got is consistent. You might be lucky to be able to get a couple of data sets, and if those, or a few data sets, and if those confirm everything, then you might make the judgment that that's reliable. You'll probably have seen variations on this graphic here as well, and in this case here, it's almost the target analogy is about what researchers need. And so if your data is all over the place, it's not very accurate, it's not very precise. If it's away from your target, it can still be very precise, but it can not be accurate. And that would probably suggest some form of systematic error if you're doing a first-hand investigation in your equipment or even in your methodology. You can be accurate, you can have low precision, and that might mean, again, some systematic problems. Of course, the bottom right is what most researchers are trying to ascertain in their investigations. Also, in terms of that accuracy and that there, question 17 from the 2020 paper is talking about what must be kept the same. And that understanding that if we look here and we look at here, the aim is to investigate a relationship between speed and the distance it travels. And so in this case here, what must we keep the same? Well, the ramp is controlling the speed. So they're rolling the marble down the ramp. So if you want to increase the speed, you change the angle of inclination. So that's something that you are changing. The release point on the ramp, again, that actually is another way you can control the speed. So that's not something you need to keep the same. The mass of the marble used, One of the things, if you've studied physics, you'll know that um, acceleration due to gravity is irrespective of mass. So in this case here, height is the one that you're keeping the same. And of course, again, this idea of engaging with the stimulus material. And the people who hadn't done physics might have a bit of trouble with that there as well. But think about how you control experiments to find the value of what you want. In this question here, what we're doing is we've got to design an investigation. Now, when you look at it there, obviously most people think an investigation, oh, you're going to do an experiment. But once you read through the question, you might think a little bit differently. So design an investigation can be used to test the claim that Mercury's period of retrograde motion correlates with disruptions to travel. So the first thing there is you've got two distinct variables that are quite different to each other. You probably need to just keep in the back of your mind that this is part of the pseudo science part of the syllabus, but that's by and by. So you've got here Mercury's retrograde motion. So that's obviously stuff you could do as a first-hand investigation, but it's probably a lot easier to get second-hand data, whether that's from a website or some astronomical society or something like that, and then looking at disruptions to travel. And again, that would have to rely on data from someone else. It could rely on something like train schedules. A lot of the train data gets released publicly in terms of lateness and things like that. You can even look at traffic data that you can find online, and then have a look at that. And so in that respects there, what you're doing is designing a second-hand investigation. And so when you look at how you've got to do this, you've got to also test the claim that there's a link between the Mercury's retrograde motion and traffic disruption. And so the sample answer given by Nessa talks about looking at Sydney airport data, which you can get as well, but any transport data. And you correlate that to the retrograde motion and determine whether there's anything going on there. And if you look there at the Nessa response as well, they talk about, you can refer to the pseudoscience using language that kind of sounds scientific. But I think the main thing there is to talk about the way you do the investigation. You talk about the fact that it is secondhand. You have to get two bits of information, combine them together. And really, to get the 4 marks, you just have to do something that can test that claim. You have to design a valid investigation. Question 30 from 2020 is 7 marks, so one of the extended response questions, and it just gives you a little bit of information that you've got to tease out. And so you've got a definitive statement. Dirty water causes the death of a human every 10 seconds worldwide. So it's just a statement. And then what you have to do is evaluate how scientific research affects health and how scientific research into water quality affects global health and human well-being. And so what you've got to do is you've got to take all those bits there. You've got to recognize that the very first thing here you're talking about is scientific research. And it's scientific research onto water quality and global health. And so you've got to make some sort of statement about the fact that if water is of a higher quality, it's going to lead to better outcomes. And you can use examples. You can talk about in poorer countries where they don't have water treatment, where people die of diseases like cholera and things that spread through water. And of course, the idea of human well-being, which is a little bit of a vague concept, but how happy you feel. And I think if you're not basically getting dysentery and cholera and diseases like that, you're probably a lot happier than people that do there. Now, you have to also talk about different methods of water treatment. And the key there is methods. So you have to talk of at least 2. And so you can also, for instance, reference a way that, say, in Australia, water's treated. And you can talk about things like flocculation, you can talk about chlorine treatment, bacterial treatment, and that there. And outline them with a little bit of detail. And so in that way there, you talk about the fact that research has allowed people to understand how bacteria can cause disease and how bacteria and viruses, and probably with water treatment you're talking more about bacteria or even sort of other microbes or other pathogens. And so when we have a look here, one of the things here, when it's got the word evaluate, if you look at the top there where it says includes a judgment, and you have to give some definitive statement. And look, in this case here, you're going to say scientific research into water quality has had a positive impact on human health and well-being. That would almost be your first statement in your answer. And then you talk about water treatment and give some examples. And that's where this thorough knowledge. So thorough knowledge means you talk about, say, chlorine treatment, which is going to destroy bacteria, or you talk about filtration, which removes large particles, or the settling dams, which are sometimes used there, which removes other things out of there. Talk about each of the things, each of the water treatments, and give a bit of information behind it. And that last little bit there communicates with coherent, logical manner and uses scientific terminology. And you can see there that that is really the difference between getting a 5 and 6 and getting into that 7. And if you look here, the sample answer given, a lot of people sort of still a little bit unsure, but you look at the sample answer, it gives dot points. And the advantage in this question here is each of those dot points represents a different type of water treatment. So the person reading this, the person marking this for you, can clearly see what you have said. And if you look at sort of the NESA feedback, obviously you need at least 2 different water treatments. That's when it says methods. The sample answer gives you 4. By all means use 4 with a bit of detail. If you only use 2, you've got to give more detail. So that might be a thing to try and put down as many as you can think of. But don't put down so many that you're going to contradict yourself. And you give an explanation of each of those. And you talk about how they work. And then, of course, you must make sure you do that judgment. And that's the key thing here as well, is that you do need strategies for writing extended responses. And so one of the things there you might want to consider is, setting up a little framework in there. It might even be advantageous if we go back for a second there and you see how there is the 4 dot points. You might even do that as a table. And you could even do that as a table where you have the name of it, how the process works, and the advantages to human health. And by doing that, what you are doing is clearly articulating to the marker that you understand that. Now, the last question in 2020, similar sort of idea here. What we have, though, is 3 bits of data. Now, they're all relating to climate change, and this one here, which is a student summary of a newspaper article, showing a graph and showing a little bit of information there. And then you also have a statement where scientists looking at the article have said that it's probably not all correct, and then a quotation from an economist. And to answer this question, what you've really got to do is take all the bits of information. And so part C of this question was worth 7 marks. And if you look here, analyze the effects of the conflicts of interest. And so conflicts of interest, which is one of those things where you've probably looked at tobacco companies and you've looked at the money that oil companies put into climate change clouding, climate change denial type industries and reports. And so what you've got to do is look at each of these. And so where it says refer the information in the 3 student summaries to support your response. So a strategy here for this 7-mark question is, if you're a little bit unsure about this, just simply write down as your starting point what each of the summaries is saying. So student summary 1 has a graph which shows water vapor, global air temperature, and the claim there by the astrophysicist that water vapor is the main contributor. And then you go to number 2. You say it's flawed reasoning because it's one scientist. Majority of scientists are going the other way. And then summary 3, write what that's saying. Now the important thing here is don't just quote from those summaries, write what you think the summary is. And then what you have to do, once you've done that, is link all the bits together. And so I'd almost start with the third one there, which is saying that the fossil fuel industry is exerting influence on on politicians, and that means that they provide data which is hard for people to understand. You can talk about the fact that most people, when they read a newspaper article, probably don't understand all the data, particularly if it's presented in a certain way. And that, you can also bring in the idea that that graph may be showing a correlation, but there may not be a causative effect. And again, what I'd suggest you possibly do is use dot points, maybe even use a table of information. Student summary 1, this says this. Student summary 2, and then link them all together. And if you look here, for 7, extensive understanding of the effects of conflicts of interest. And really, that's what you're looking at there. That's the main thrust of the question, conflicts of interests. And then what you've got to do is link those all together. So refer to information from each of the 3 sources. If the first thing you've done is just sort of paraphrased and written down what you think each of those mean, then you're doing pretty well. And of course, that logic coherent response using scientific language. Now, another thing there with that logical and coherent response, that can mean dot points, that can mean tables of information. It means that the person reading your response is able to clearly understand what you are saying and understand your points. And one of the other things there, really, if you look there again, just looking at that a little bit closer there, the difference between the 5, 6, and the 7, similar to the last question, is your writing ability. And in this case here, the other thing interesting from the sample answer as well, is if you look there, there is little subheadings. So collection of data, interpretation of data. And so one of the things here is the point there on the right. 1, you need to extract simulation, it's information from the stimuli, but you've got to be able to present your response clearly.